Welcome back to EV Insights, the podcast. I'm Sandra Dreyer, and I am very excited to bring this episode to everybody. In today's episode, I speak with Cristal Mikenas, who is the Associate Director and Global Employer Brand Leader at Takeda. In this episode, we talked a lot about employee engagement in the employer brand messaging. So we've talked about the importance of employee-generated content. We talked about how to really create employee ambassadors so you have that insight and that voice on the content that you share. And we also talked a lot about helping recruiters become really your employer brand advocates and making their job easier as they're speaking to candidates. I honestly could have spoken to Cristal for several more hours, so wouldn't be surprised if we have a part 2 to this podcast on the topics that we didn't get a chance to cover. But I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed speaking with Cristal, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Hello and welcome back to EB Insights, the podcast for anyone who is focusing on employer brand. We are super excited to bring yet another amazing employer brand expert to you. Her name is Cristal Mikenas, and she is the Associate Director and Global Employer Brand Leader at Takeda, which is a global biopharmaceutical company that focuses on research and development. So prior to specializing in employer branding, because all of us have had a background prior to employer branding for the most part, Cristal has actually a background in HR communications and employee engagement. And one thing that we also have in common is that she spent many years in event planning and management. So maybe we'll have another podcast, Cristal, where you and I can share war stories in that area. So while at Takeda, Cristal has led the transformation of their global employer brand function. And today I'm really excited to learn a bit more from Cristal about that journey. So Cristal, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk about my favorite topic, employer brand, and share more about what we've been doing at Takeda. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So exciting. So you've had, as I talked about in the intro, you kind of navigated your way into employer branding. And a lot of people who are going to be watching this podcast might be new in this area or might support people in this area. So can you talk to me about how you navigated into this area? What was the sort of impetus of you kind of, really going forward with your career here?
Sure. So I always like to say if someone told me at the start of my career I would be in the employer brand space, I think I would ask them, what does that even mean? What is this space? I have no idea. But now that I'm here, I feel like it is such a perfect culmination of all the things that get me excited and all the different skills that I feel I bring to the table. So early on, I thought I would be a psychologist. I was always interested in what motivates people to do what they do, to take the actions that they take. So I went to school for that, and following graduation, I just needed to work. So I took up different jobs. I was a part of the event management, event planning space, which was really exciting. It helped me to learn to be agile. And that's where I found my love and passion for just connecting with people and understanding their stories and what brings them to these events, what is inspiring them or motivating them to be a part of an organization or a part of this event. So through that, I naturally just started to connect with people across different businesses, different industries, and that's where I found myself in a tech role at a startup company. And I was really just doing employee liaison work, HR communications, planning internal events. And that's when I got connected into our recruiting and TA team and understanding how do we take all the great work that we're doing internally for our people, for our employees, and using that and doing the same for our candidates to attract them to the organization and help them understand what makes us so great. And little did I know at the time, this is employer branding. I was just naturally creating stories, gathering content from our folks internally, putting together newsletters and talking with candidates. And this is when I really started to dip my toe in the employer brand space. And now I have done this work over, I would say, almost 10 years, which is crazy to think about, across different industries. So tech, biotech, pharma now. So that's my that's my journey to employer brand, and I wouldn't have expected it. I'm so glad to be here.
You know what's interesting? You mentioned in school you studied psychology, and
Mm-hmm.
I was actually had spoken with Tiffany Pedersen of Amazon last week. We were talking about consumer marketing and sort of, understanding the principles of marketing in general. And she did mention, and she speaks at different schools about sort of, to kids who are looking at what to major in. And she said psychology is a great place to start. And I joked that, my older daughter is going to college next year. When I asked her what she wants to do, she wanted a dual degree in biology and psychology. And at first I was like, psychology, but it is so true. It's understanding what motivates people. I mean, that's marketing 101. So it feels like this is kind of a common thread I'm starting to
Mm-hmm.
hear from people about what's important in terms of a skill set in this field as well. So you've been in this for about 10 years. What have you seen evolve over the past few years? I mean, obviously this space is evolving. Where do you see some of the biggest evolutions in employer brand?
Mm-hmm. I think it's not unsimilar to other areas of HR or TA. Of course, technology has just grown so much in the past 10 years, especially when we think about the employer brand space specifically. I think when I first started out, there weren't many platforms or tools. I mean, outside of things like your ATS or your career site, now we're seeing so many more platforms, so many more resources that are specifically geared towards the employer brand space that are helping to make our lives easier, more efficient, making it possible to streamline and get the work that we're creating and all of the things that we're doing and getting it in the hands of our recruiters and in the hands of our employees in a much easier way. So I think technology is number one. And I think just the importance or the value that organizations are placing on employer brand and recruitment marketing. When I first came into this space and at a couple of organizations that I've worked at, we're working on little to no budget whatsoever. You just have to be scrappy and do what you can with what you have. Where now, and I think it could be different from organization to organization, but I think there is a better understanding or at least awareness of employer brand and the importance of it as part of the ecosystem. So I think we're seeing a shift and an importance placed on this, and people and organizations are willing to put more money and more budget to these types of activities. So I'm grateful for that for sure. I'm able to do a lot more and get a lot more creative now than I was a few years ago, just with the amount of resources that I have at my fingertips. And the last piece, I think, just as time goes on, we have so much more research to look at. There's so much more data available to us that allows us to fine tune and streamline our strategies and understand exactly what we've been talking about, what motivates candidates, and get super specific based on location, skill set, all of these facets. So I think we have so much more to work with, which is exciting, but it can also be overwhelming because there's a lot of noise, right? So being able to understand for your organization and for where you're at in your journey, what's important, what are the platforms, what are the tools, what are the resources you should be focusing on with where you're at in your journey, and moving forward accordingly, because everything isn't for everybody. Very much how, when we think about employer branding, we're not trying to advertise and market to the whole, but instead the people who are right for our organization. So I think we as employer brand practitioners, we need to look through that same lens when we're evaluating who we're working with, what we're bringing on and what we're introducing to an organization. Does it make sense for us right now? Is it the right fit? Is it meeting a goal or a purpose that we actually need in this moment? Because even though we have more budgets, we have more resources, it's not infinite. So we have to be thoughtful about those decisions that we're making.
Yeah, 100%. I think, it's one of those industries that's newer. When you
Mm-hmm.
look at, especially compared to consumer marketing, which has been around for eons, there's tons of data and research and insights, whereas employer brand is still newer. But in all of those newer industries, you have a lot more companies that are coming with solutions. And, it
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, to your point, narrowing down what is important for my business and for our candidates and the type of talent that we're getting. And one of the questions I was actually going to ask you is, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen in this industry? One that I have seen, in both working internally with a company, but also, consulting and working with companies as a consultant, is that employer brand is a time and place. It's like, oh, we need to hire, got to invest in employer brand. Oh, we're not hiring right now. We're not going to invest. Oh, we got to hire again. And in my opinion, and I think, a lot of people would support that, employer brand is always on. You might dial up and down your recruitment marketing activity based on hiring numbers or needs, but your brand is something that needs to be a constant investment. What are some other, you've talked about, you're not marketing to the whole world, you're marketing to specific. So what are some other mistakes that you see made in this area?
Yeah, I totally agree. What came to my mind as soon as you started to ask the question is employer brand is a long game, right? And you're not always going to be employing the same tactics at the same time every time. So I think just realizing that when it comes to employer brand, it's not a one size fits all, especially when you're in a global organization or a large organization. One tactic or a campaign that works for a specific talent segment may not work or provide the same results for another. So I think you need to look at everything and the context and the circumstances for what they are. That doesn't mean you need to recreate the wheel every time, which is kind of challenge number two or mistake number two, but instead build out processes, build out a templated approach that you can lift and shift and customize or localize each time you're approaching an activity. But being flexible, being agile, so you have your tools in your toolkit that you could pull out, but using them and fitting them for purpose based on the specific challenge you're addressing. So that's one thing. And I think the other challenge is when communicating with your stakeholders, being able to speak with them at a level and with language that they understand. Because I think even though people appreciate and feel such a connection to employer branding, there are nuances or differences in what they make of employer branding and what we know our work is. So, for example, a challenge that I have faced in a couple different organizations is I find that different functions always want their own EVP. We need to create our own EVP. And it's a matter of kind of having that discussion and understanding, okay, what is the problem you're trying to solve for? Number one. Number two, helping your stakeholders to understand, do you really need an EVP or are you just looking for more customized messaging? Because at the end of the day, our EVP is global. It's for the organization as a whole. And then we can tailor those message, dial up, dial down based on who we're speaking to. But I think making sure that everyone you're interacting with has that common language, has that common knowledge, making sure to bring people with you along the way and finding those opportunities to educate and doing that consistently. So I think to summarize a couple things, Number one, realizing it's a long game, being able to streamline your processes, but also being able to flex within that, and making sure you're bringing your stakeholders, your ambassadors, your leadership on the journey with you so that they're learning and understanding and feeling that connection and feeling invested in it too. So that when you're having those conversations down the line, they're able to have a greater appreciation for it and understand the value that you're bringing to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just hit on such a hot topic that I kind of want to just continue to pull that thread a little bit, which is different parts of a business feeling they need their own identity or their own EVP. To satisfy their hiring needs or their external reputation. I would imagine many people that are watching this have faced this issue. And, I've definitely seen it repetitively in my career as well, with one area of a business saying, no, we're very, very different. So we cannot use the same EVP. And, I would have an answer to this, but how would you help people educate stakeholders on employer brand, EVP, and then the marketing materials, solutions, or sort of strategy you need in place within your business function? How do you what are some tips that you can give people? Because it sounds like you've had this conversation many times. I know I have as well, but I think this is a really important one to pick up on.
Yeah, I think as much as possible, show, don't just tell, because I think for employer brands, since it is a newer space, most people have an understanding of what marketing is at least the foundational level, but employer brand is very different. While people may have heard about it, it's becoming more relevant. It's a hot topic in hiring and HR. There's still kind of some misconceptions and a lack of understanding. So as much as you can show examples of what you're talking about and showing how this system and these different pieces work together, I think that will go a long way. And as I said, doing that consistently. So creating an opportunity to connect with your stakeholders, engage with them, whether you're hosting an office hour session or sending out a weekly newsletter, or better yet, doing all of these things together the same way that we are marketing and branding to our external audiences. You kind of want to take the same approach internally as well. And I'm not talking about ambassadors and doing an internal campaign to engage people in that way, but simply from that education standpoint, create an entire campaign there so that you're building on these concepts. But I think demonstrating or providing very specific examples of, hey, here's what we're talking about when we're talking about brand, here's how it supports us, here's the value that it can provide, and the KPIs or the results we're expecting from that. And then taking it a notch down and saying, and here's how this applies to you. Here's how we are going to localize and customize this message for you and what you can expect at the end of it. So I think being super clear with those expectations, what the outcomes and the deliverables will be, and what purpose they serve. Because one thing that I've come up against a few times is our stakeholders know and believe we need to do all these activities. We need to go to these events. We need to host in-person coffee chats, different things like that. But then they may be upset or questioning, why didn't we make any hires off of these different tactics? And I always say it's not fair to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, because that's not what it's intended to do. So I think outlining and creating a clear menu of services, of tactics, but on the same side saying, and this is what it supports. This is what we're going to measure as success. So making sure that everyone's on the same page from the beginning, but starting again with that conversation of what is the challenge you're trying to solve for? Oh, and by the way, here are all the different things that we can employ to meet that challenge. So I think it's a little bit of both, helping folks to understand just what all of this is, but personalizing it as much as possible, having those conversations so you understand who you're talking to and what will resonate with them. And I think that also just goes a long way in creating that trust, building that credibility, and that mutual understanding with one another.
Yeah, I love that saying, you can't expect a fish to climb a tree. And, I'm going to use that, Crystal. I'm going to find a way of using that sometime this week. One of the
It'll
things
come up more than you think, I
I
promise.
love that. And also, when you think about it, just from a pure marketing perspective, when you think of the rule of seven, that
Mm.
a consumer has to see something 7 times before they make a decision. Imagine you're talking about your career. It's one thing to say purchase watch or something versus your career. This is a very personal decision.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, it might be one of the most important 7 steps that there's, or 7 times they're seeing you at this event, because it's reinforcing your name recognition. So you may not get that immediate click. Just like if you're doing advertising, they may not click on that ad, but they may click on something they've seen because they've seen that ad a few times. So
Mm-hmm.
it is that sort of balance. I think the other thing too is when I hear a lot of people struggling with, all these different departments need different EVPs. If you're looking at it from a candidate perspective, who's hiring you? And I'm
Exactly.
not going to use any specific names to protect the guilty or the innocent, but if it is ABC company and that's what you're familiar with, you're being hired by ABC company. You're not thinking ABC company research, ABC company tech, ABC company. You're
Mm-hmm.
thinking ABC company. So that value proposition is to ABC company and the employee.
Yeah.
Unless you have a holding company situation like, I would say like a Diageo that has all of these different alcohol brands, they may think, yes, Diageo is the employer, but I'm going to work for Johnny Walker. So there might be a little bit more of a specificity in that branding because you want them to connect with the brand. But otherwise, it is, in their mind, who's hiring them? It's
Mm-hmm.
ABC company. It's not this unit of ABC company. They're seeing that bigger picture. So that's the importance of the consistency in messaging, because if they're seeing that message 7 times, don't compete with yourself and have different messages and different branding, because then you're sort of defeating the purpose of that rule of seven. If you're consistent and they're consistently seeing ABC company, then they will self-select into that area that is the most appropriate for their skill set.
Exactly. And I would even add that when you're considering joining an organization, you are, of course, trying to weed through and understand what those internal politics are like. What's that internal makeup? And from a candidate's perspective, if I'm putting myself in their shoes and I'm seeing all this kind of siloed or these micro brands, I might think to myself, oh, this strikes me as an organization that maybe isn't communicating with one another,
Very
or there might
siloed.
be very siloed, or there might be more value placed on one group over the other. Do I want to join this team? Will I be a part of the team that's getting all of that love and attention, or will I be a part of the team that's maybe being neglected for whatever reason, lack of resources or what have you? But I think it certainly signals to the candidate the inner workings of that organization too, and we want to join a company that feels united, that feels cohesive, and that you feel you can come into and understand what your place is in the organization, how you work together with these other groups. So I think it's incredibly important to make sure that you have that overarching message, that overarching story. And yes, you can communicate the specifics of that team or that role as you get further in the process. I think there's a time and place for those unique and differentiated messages. But when we're talking top of funnel or we're talking employer brand versus recruitment marketing, we have to set the stage first of here's who we are, here's what we do, here's how you can fit in here.
That is such an important message. What is the subliminal message you're sending to candidates by having such a disparate marketing strategy? That's a really important point. So moving it into Takeda and the space where you are now, it is very apparent that Takeda focuses and prioritizes their employer brand.
Mhm.
And not just from the work I know you're doing personally, but I think for the seventh year in a row, Takeda has received global top employer certification from the Top Employers Institute program, which is a significant achievement, because it really shows the investment and the prioritization that Takeda has put on this part of their business strategy. For some watching this podcast, they may be really trying to articulate the value and importance of this. So, taking maybe a lesson from Takeda, how has that evolved and developed into such a obviously priority for them?
Yeah, so I think because we're such a large and global organization, we wanted something that would be relevant for people across our different regions, across our different business units, something that one instills pride in the folks who already work here, but number two, something that signals how much we truly care, how much we invest in our people, in our culture, and creating a space that is inclusive and people feel like they can belong. And this is just one of the ways that we do that because of the stringent criteria and the process that Top Employer has us go through. We felt that it was the most robust and could truly solidify our commitment in those areas. The other piece of it is when you think about a global organization, while we have and spoke about the importance of having an overarching message and a story that unifies, we also need to be smart about those cultural nuances and differences between countries or regions. And that's something that I've noticed for sure. Accolades and recognition and these type of rewards or awards are very important in key areas. Think about Europe, think about India. These awards mean quite a lot. And if you're moving into a new market where you're relatively unknown, this helps you to get in front of this new audience, and it helps to give you more credibility and more trust from candidates who are perhaps first interacting with you. It might encourage them to give you a second look or dive deeper. So I think it's incredibly important, especially for global organizations, especially for organizations who are moving into new markets and you're working on building up that awareness and making a name for yourself. And then there's another piece of it where, quite frankly, if a lot of your other peers and other organizations that you're competing against are on these lists and you're not, I think that says a lot more even than you just having this award, but who's not on these lists. So I think it's a multifaceted approach of why we're investing in this type of thing. I think to solidify our commitments, but also making sure that we're amongst our peers and able to go into new areas, being able to say, hey, you may not know about us, but here's something that helps you understand who we are and what we're about a little bit more.
And it's a unification as well of the brand story. When you have that sort of global recognition, it is a little bit of, there has to be some consistency in
Mm-hmm.
your story. It's not just in specific pockets when you get that kind of a recognition. So, and that's it. This is a really important point that I would love to pick up on with you as well, which is that the global nature of
Mm-hmm.
managing an employer brand function. I've done it. I know many people who are on this podcast have done it or are going to be doing it. And obviously, you're dealing with a significant number of differentiating factors when you're managing your brand globally, not just culturally, but also the type of businesses that you're competing with in each area, the type of employees that you're hiring, what are the skill sets? Do you have certain areas that are, hiring specific skills than others? What are some of the maybe strategies that you and your team are deploying to kind of help you manage that at a global level with the eye on consistency, but also understanding all of those differentiating factors and how to sort of balance that?
Absolutely. I would say we're kind of leveraging a 3P system. So, making sure that we're addressing our people needs, that we are creating clear and consistent processes, and investing in platforms that make our jobs easier and the lives of our recruiters and our ambassadors easier. So, when we talk about our people, I think it's number one, really understanding what are those, as you said, cultural nuances or differences, understanding what is resonating with the people in your different locations, regions, business units. And that is number one, being able to set up a continuous listening strategy so that you can understand what is motivating for them, what are their challenges, what do they like most about working at the organization. So that way you can track and measure, is your EVP, is your employer brand still relevant? Because it really is a living thing. Just because you've conducted this exercise doesn't mean you can set it and forget it. So you want to continuously check back in with your people, making sure that you have a pulse on the organization, whether it's just evaluating what's already in place today with your employee engagement surveys, or creating new activity to be able to understand that. So I think understanding your people is number one, and what those differences are across these different facets. Processes, when you're talking about a global organization, especially one like Takeda, where we have 50,000 people across 80 different countries, it is incredibly difficult to cascade information or make sure that everyone has the latest updates to everything. There are just so many different variables to account for. So I think to have a streamlined and as simple of a process as possible that people can plug into will make your life so much easier. As I mentioned in one of my earlier comments, setting those expectations clearly, being able to have a common space where your folks can go to find resources, to get information on what you used for what. So making sure you have the organization and that side of the house in order and tending to it regularly, because I think that's something I know I've been guilty of in the past and being more conscious of, but revisiting your processes on a regular basis to say, okay, is this what we're still doing? Are we documenting what we're doing, and having that in one place? And then the other piece is platforms. If you have the ability to invest in platforms, do that. You will be so much better off for it. We, of course, have invested in Clickify, which has given us a tremendous power to be able to disseminate a lot of information and creatives that are being put out as part of our employer brand. We're able to track and measure the effectiveness of these resources out on our various channels, but also what types of resources are resonating with our people, what are they gravitating towards. And we're able to just empower our organization more with these platforms, making their jobs easier. What can we automate and do to put more of this type of content and these types of resources in the hands of our people so that they can also help to be champions of the brand. So I think focusing on those three areas is incredibly important when you're approaching such a huge task of managing or launching a global brand.
And I think one of the things that, sometimes in this function, employer branding, you touched on it before, which is, people are investing in it more and people are understanding the importance of it. But we still don't all come from large teams for the most part. And so when you're talking about Takeda in 80 countries, you don't have employer brand representatives in each of those 80 countries, right? So are you, to that point around the platforms and making sure you have something that's consistent, do you have a specific way of identifying champions, or are you working through your local recruiters, your TA function? How are you putting that? You can do the platforms, but it's not like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. So
Yeah.
how are you kind of implementing the advocacy in these different territories? And obviously it's not going to be, beautiful and rosy on day one or maybe even day 20, but
Yeah.
how are you putting those things into place? Because I'm assuming you're managing this from one smaller team, but you really are
Mhm.
trying to have a span of a quite large span.
Absolutely. I think especially because a lot of our employer brand teams are pretty small. Even right now, I have 3 people. We're growing, and by the end of the year, we'll have about 7 in total. But when again you think about the sheer size of the organization, that's still a pretty small cohort of people to carry out and execute this work. So I would say whether you're a team of 1, a team of 7, a team of 10, what have you, I think leaning into and leaning on other people within your business will be paramount to being able to activate, to being able to engage ambassadors, so that you can partner with different areas of the business who can help support and spread the good word of what you're doing. So we have very close relationships with our HR comms team. We've built a system with our HRBLs where if we're sourcing for stories or we need people to be a part of a project, who better to go to than those resources within the business who have the pulse on the people. So yes, we're talking with our recruiters, but we're also connecting with our HR leaders and then the heads of our different business units to say, okay, we know that this is going on within your organization or this event happened. Who was a part of that effort, we'd love to talk with them. So I think making sure that you're connected into different parts of the business, any other communicators that you have within your team, so your corporate communications or corporate branding teams, your marketing teams, anyone who has a role where they're sending out a newsletter or creating a podcast, how can you tag up with them and piggyback on the work that they're doing or exchanging, I would say, tactics, so to speak. So, for example, if we're running a campaign, we make sure to connect with these different communicators to say, okay, how do we collaborate on this to make the most out of this one piece of content? How do we slice it and dice it in as many ways as possible? Because you get more bang for your buck, so to speak, but also you're building that relationship. You're building that favor and that collaboration of, okay, now I know because this team supported or connected in or allowed me to plug into their campaign. Next time I'm working on something, I'm going to ask them to be a part of this too. So you naturally kind of start to grow legs within the organization. So I think making sure that you're connecting with those other communicators, other leaders within the business, and identifying what are all those touch points or all those forums that you have internally to get messages out to people. So very similarly, again, with employer brand, when you're communicating externally to candidates, you're looking at Glassdoor, Fishbowl, LinkedIn, Instagram, all these places where your people are living. You have to do that same thing for your internal folks as well. What are all the different areas they're looking to for information? How do you get your work and the resources that you're creating for these folks there so that everywhere they turn, there's something for them to grab onto and run with. And then finally, being super clear in that what you want these folks to do. What do you want them to do with the content that you're creating? Is it just a like and a share on LinkedIn? Is it taking this, I don't know, story and sharing it at a team meeting? I think being very clear about what people can use the resources you're creating for helps to take the guesswork out of it. Because I think naturally people want to be engaged, people want to be a part of the organization, they want to feel proud of the work, but they also have day jobs. Their minds are also so focused on their work that they're doing and that they're a part of the organization to do. How do you make it as easy as possible for them to do what you want them to do?
Yeah, and that comes with streamlining your process, to your point. So if you are
Mhm.
asking a recruiter, for example, to leverage material that you've created, you don't want them to have to go to four different places to find it, to repurpose it. It's that sort of one location, as simple as possible, to add to their day, because some of these recruiters could have 10, 20, 30, 40 recs that they're managing, and
Mhm.
they're not going to have the capacity to go to multiple locations to find things. They're going to have a one and done, in a sense, to
Exactly.
increase engagement.
Absolutely.
And you've touched on, so I want to just, we'll get to sort of wrapping this up, but you've touched on some really important points I don't want to lose. And so one of them around the stakeholder piece of it. And I think for anyone in this function, it is definitely, you could always use triple the amount of resources that you have, no question. And I really absolutely buy onto that stakeholder concept, which is, go into a whiteboard and say, all right, who is it that I need to work with in this organization to get the content I need, the approvals I need, the budget I need, the help I need, the entry into an event I need, all of those things. You kind of list out your stakeholders and then say, okay, well, what are their motivators? So
Mhm.
before I even talk about what I need, what are their key motivators? Because the reality is, if I am helping serve something for them, they will work with me. I'm sure they're all great, nice people, but just like with the recruiters, we all have day jobs that are very full. So how do I help solve a problem for them? And then that is my entry point into, let's work together on this, right? So that could be from a budget perspective, that could be from a messaging perspective. But I think those stakeholder discussions are extremely important. And having those sort of negotiations before you need them is
Mhm.
very important. And I think for anyone who's starting into a new role in employer brand, even if they're just replacing someone that just left, take that clean slate approach and think, okay, how do I come into this and really build those alliances, but also get what I need to achieve from
Mhm.
these relationships? I think that's extremely important. And we don't want to just find those stakeholders when we need them. We need to nurture those relationships just like we need to nurture relationships with candidates. So
Exactly. And I think you mentioned something really important is we can work with the nicest people, but at the end of the day, they're going to have their own priorities. How do you make sure the work that you're doing is also a priority for them by understanding what their challenges are, what their goals are, and how the work that you're doing can support what is already going on in their space? So as much as you can find those connections and opportunities to collaborate, you'll be so much better off for it. In fact, I feel like my first year at Takeda wasn't focused on doing anything new or experimenting or introducing anything to the business. It was understanding what are the problems that we have today? How do I respond to the needs that are most prevalent in this moment? And again, building that trust, building that credibility, and being able to show the value that myself and my team can bring to the organization. And once you've proven that, then you'll have much more flexibility, much more leeway, much more support from these folks to try something new, introduce something exciting to the business, and they'll be that much more likely to pick it up and run with it because you now have this track record of success and collaboration and, quite frankly, care. I think if you are able to show your stakeholders and show your collaborators that you genuinely care about their work and how to make it successful, they'll, in most cases, reciprocate.
100%. Another point I wanted to pick up on what you had talked about was getting content, right? So it's
Mhm.
the importance of that content. So there are so many statistics about the value of employee generated content versus corporate content, right? So I think just a few I picked up to talk about today. So employees have 10 times more followers on average than a brand account. So you just think about the reach that they have when they post something versus a branded account when it posts something. Content shared by employees gets 8 times more engagement than content shared through branded channels. Employee post gets reshared up to 24 times more than a branded post, 24 times more than a branded post. And 92% of consumers will turn to people they know for referrals, right? So that is all about kind of going into that employee referral process, but also a referral could be an employee talking about how great their company is and really talking about a day in the life and what they're doing, what they're experiencing. So you've done a great job at Takeda leveraging the power of that employee generated content and social sharing. Can you share a little bit about how somebody starts that process? Because I do think, you've touched on data, really understanding what's resonating and going down that road, but also what's in it for the employee. Why would they want to share content? Why would they want to sort of support this effort? Can you just kind of talk and touch on that just a bit as we're wrapping up? Because I think that's a really important, great success that you've had that I think others could learn from.
Yeah, sure. So if I think back to my early days when I was just a baby brander, I think I was a little bit naive and was like, okay, I can just put out a call for stories and they will come flocking to me to share their experience. And that was not the case. I would hear crickets. So I think leaning into specific moments or events that are taking place at your organization that people are generally feeling positive around. If you've just won a particular award, if you have an annual sales kickoff, or identifying those moments throughout the year where people are feeling maybe high on their positive emotions, where you're going to have a lot of people together at one time, where you can kind of tap into this group so that it's just kind of a natural part of these types of events in these instances. So that's number one, identifying those points throughout the year. The second thing is leaning into those connections that you've already made, your collaborators. So for us, we go to our HR business leaders to ask them for leads, or we will say, hey, these are the different campaigns that we're running this quarter. Who do you think would be great for a career development story to talk about our values, or who is hiring, so we can talk with those teams? And then there's another piece that I think we can do a lot better and that we've started to do is leveraging our data, leveraging our ATS. So when we talk about a career development campaign, pulling a report and saying, okay, over the past year, who has had a career move, who's moved up in the organization, who's moved across, because I think sometimes it's easier to go to some of your stakeholders or these connections who are helping you source leads and giving them something to react to versus coming up with something entirely new. It takes the burden off of them a little bit, where it's like, hey, we have pulled this report. We see that these 5 people have moved up in the organization. Are these people that you would recommend as telling a great story, or who should we prioritize first? So I think leveraging what's already at your fingertips is super helpful as a starting point. And then that last piece that you mentioned, maybe around incentivizing employees, I think making it super clear around how this can support and empower their own personal brands. Maybe giving them a follow-up, like if you're creating a campaign and someone's being featured in it, maybe also tagging on, here's a social card that you can share on your own LinkedIn to promote that you've been a part of this story, or to promote your accomplishment, or whatever it is. So adding in a what's in it for them, or how can you boost and support them in their career. One other thing that we do is we have something called We Celebrate. It's through WorkHuman. It's like a recognized platform. So when people participate in our storytelling initiatives, we recognize them in that way. So there's a public recognition board, but they also get points that they can then use to purchase items, gift cards, whatever it is. So making sure that every time you're asking an employee or employees for something, that you also have a give back to them, whether it's something to use or boost their own profile or some other means of recognition, whatever platform or vehicle you have at your organization, embedding that as part of your process. In fact, when we have a checklist for our campaigns, we have a number of things that we do every time we're approaching a new campaign, and that recognition piece is on the list as well.
That is fantastic. And I think too, I know obviously you use Clickify for your social sharing and for your employee advocacy as well. There's a leaderboard. So if you're using any kind of a platform where you can see who's sharing content and sort of, who's at the top of the leaderboard, you could do monthly, prizes or monthly
Mm-hmm.
awards. The other thing too that I would just add to that is onboarding and integrating with the onboarding process, because you're never happier in your career than during your onboarding process, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you want to talk about the new job you have, you want to talk about the new company you have, you're incentivized to do so because you're not yet overwhelmed in your day-to-day job. And so, maybe integrating with the team that does the onboarding process and putting some kind of incentive into that. If they do, if they share 3 pieces of content their first 3 months or have you, this is they could end win merchandise or something, because again, that's I think when you're the most excited about your career as well. I think it depends on how your company operates, but those are all really great examples of getting people involved. Well,
Absolutely.
Cristal, thank you so much. It has been so insightful. I know, having followed Takeda and having watched all of the great content that you've been producing, and obviously the recognition that Takeda is getting, it's a great success story. And I think there's so much that people can learn from you. And I just really want to thank you for joining us today. For anyone who might be looking at this that is super early or even interested in a career in employer brand, I'm going to have you kind of bring us out with just a couple of tips that you might have given yourself 10 years ago before you started a career in employer branding that you could share with others.
Yeah, I would say be curious. Be curious about all aspects of the organization and the business that you're working for. Make as many connections as possible, whether that's because you're looking for different stories or just building out your network. You never know when you may need to lean on other people for support, whether it's for an internal project or when you're looking for your next opportunity. Ask questions, really approach every conversation with a tremendous amount of care and a goal of understanding what is important to that person, how you can collaborate, or what are opportunities to connect. So I would say that's probably the most important. The second thing is you don't need to do everything at once. I think that sometimes, especially when you're on a smaller team or an individual, it's very easy to feel like, oh my gosh, I have all of these things to juggle. I have to accomplish all of them. Instead, prioritize, understand your own goal. What is the most important thing that you're looking to address in this moment, and strategize around that. And then you can build on it over time. If you're trying to do too much at once, you won't do any of that successfully. So I think identifying just a handful of things that you can accomplish, that you want to focus moving the needle on, and kind of backtrack from there to understand where you want to go next. And then just be kind to yourself. I think we're all under a lot of pressure to accomplish and do good work. We're all just trying to do the best that we can and figure out what is working for our organizations and have fun. I think a lot of this work and why a lot of us continue on in this space is because we get to wear so many different hats. We get to experiment. We get to just really connect with different people, and there is a lot of fun to be had. So I would say enjoy it. Enjoy every moment, even the hard ones.
That's such great advice. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you do sometimes forget, gosh, we have such fun, creative, opportunities that so many other
Mhm.
professions don't have. And I love the advice you gave about, the prioritization. And I think too, if you're starting new in this role, thinking about those quick wins, right? Because
Mhm.
if you want to start to build your internal value in the business, but also to start to show what success employer brand can actually have for the business, as you're prioritizing, what are some of those kind of shorter term wins that you could show in the work that you're doing? Such great advice, Crystal. Thank you so much. This has been a delight.
Likewise, thanks so much, Sandra. I really appreciate the conversation, and hopefully, we have another one soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.